I always think the best way to encourage people to turn up is to start without them. So we're expecting 1 or 2 people more, but I think we'll start now. So I'm Brendan Donnelly. I'm the director of the Federal Trust. Welcome to all of you. I see there are some visitors, participants here this evening who perhaps haven't attended any of our previous Federal Trust events. We're working in conjunction with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the Global Policy Institute to discuss this evening, particularly with reference to our German friends, the great question of the European Union at the moment, climate change and the Green Deal. And we are very lucky to have 3 eminently qualified people to talk about this evening. And before I just introduce them, I should pass on the greetings of Matthias Barner from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I'm told there's recently been an election in Germany, which has led to a slightly unpredictable outcome. And obviously that takes up a lot of energies of everyone who's interested in participating in German politics. So once again, best wishes to Matthias, and I pass on his best wishes to you. Our first speaker this evening is going to be a German colleague, Professor Andreas Goldthau. He's the chair for public policy at the University of Erlangen and also heads an important panel on energy justice and the global south. He previously held a chair at Royal Holloway College, and he studied and taught in the United States. So he's obviously someone with a lot of background in the Anglophone world, and it'll be very interesting to see any comparisons he may want to draw between Anglophone attitudes and continental attitudes. His particular interests are low carbon transition, energy security, and global energy governance. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Andreas. Perhaps you'd like to begin by saying whether you think that a new German government, if we have one, will make any difference to German policy on the environment, or perhaps you might like to save that as a culmination for your remarks and begin however you want. Thank you very much for joining us. Get going.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here and back in London, even only virtually. And thanks much for having me. Well, as you said, the German situation is a little bit unexpected, and things are very much unclear still, I would argue. But the long and the short of it is I don't expect a lot of surprises. We'll see attempts to balance, a very green agenda, because the Greens came out strongly, even if not as strong as they had hoped for, with a more liberal agenda. And that means a more, an agenda that's more attuned to markets and technology innovation. And that has to be balanced somehow. And I guess that's the big issue to deal with at the moment. We try and really kind of keep an ear on what's happening at the moment, but the long and the short of it is we don't really know what's coming. There's nothing coming out of the talks. And it's very, very difficult to say what might be the details of how you want to, solve the conundrum of merging a very green agenda with a very liberal pro-market agenda. But they have to find a way. It's going to be a threesome. It's going to be 3 parties that have to find a conclusion here. And as we've learned, that's the only thing we've learned. Things are in a good way. So we might have what they call a Greenlight coalition, each bringing their own specificities to the climate policy agenda. The Social Democrats will probably focus more on the just transition aspect of all of this. And if you take market, green, and justice together, then this might be the climate policy going forward. But maybe, if I can, I would just, because all of this is pretty up in the air still, I might just turn a little bit more to the European agenda here, because whatever the Germans do, it's embedded in a very kind of clear European context. The Germans don't act alone, and nor do the French or the Italians or anyone else. We have a clear European climate policy agenda, and that agenda defines where we need to be going, by when, and also by which means. The details then are to be hammered out on the national level. But I guess the main point here is that in order to understand what national governments do and might have to do in order to decarbonize their economies, we probably need to first understand EU climate policies. And for this, we need to understand how the EU works. Now, that sounds like a truism, really, but it's actually a lot more than that, because the EU, unlike Germany or the UK and other countries, it's not a proper state. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a budget. It doesn't own anything. It doesn't have assets. But what it does, in fact, it exerts indirect influence, because most of what it does is through regulations, directives, communications, and these kind of things. And that's also why we call the EU a regulatory state. And that regulatory state comes with a strong liberal blueprint. So it's all about creating markets and making them work. And by the way, thanks to our British friends who really kind of got that into the DNA of the European Union. And that's what the EU has done for quite some time, ending up in a single European market. Now, this doesn't mean that the EU is not able to exert political power. And in fact, the EU does exert political power through regulation. We have seen this, for instance, when the EU essentially stopped South Stream, a major pipeline. But it also does that in the climate domain. But it, by way of using its very specific toolbox. So I'll give you just two examples. One is, for instance, the European Union does not say green investment because it cannot invest. It doesn't have a budget. What the EU says, and what Brussels says, what the Commission says, is taxonomy. The taxonomy is essentially a set of guidelines separating the green from the brown investment with a view to mobilizing private sector capital. The European Union does not say carbon tax because it cannot tax. It's not a proper state. It says European trading system, emissions trading system, which is a way of creating markets for emission permits and making them work. And that's precisely what you would expect a liberal regulatory state actor to do. Now, the difficulty with this is this toolbox is good at internalizing negative externalities, greenhouse gas emissions. It's not very good at creating a well-rounded climate and energy policy strategy. And that gets me to my second point, and that is more with a view to how this pans out with an external dimension of what the EU does, also maybe possibly towards the UK. The internal market, because this is one of the few things that the EU can really control and make work, will become an important means to foster EU climate policies. There's two reasons for that. One is the exclusive EU competence lies in external trade. And the second thing is a regulatory state like, the Brussels machinery can only act externally through leveraging the market that it regulates. And what we've seen therefore is the emergence of multiple ways in which you can think about a link between trade and climate. So just think about FTAs, free trade agreements. We have chapters on trade, sustainable development, and all of that with Japan, Ecuador, Georgia, South Korea. We're at the moment moving towards what's called a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which essentially is about taxing carbon at the border for products that come with a higher carbon footprint. And that's an approach that only works because of a sizable, attractive internal market. But it also in turn means that that very market becomes a tool for climate policy. And by the way, something that the national governments of the European Union have okayed and agreed on. So you could say this is smart, but there may be some problems with this. And maybe I can quickly elaborate on the third point and then conclude. The third point is essentially about whatever a $16 trillion economy does, it has external effects on anyone who deals with them. So the EU's climate policies, its decarbonization efforts, and the EU Green Deal, they will produce spillovers. So for instance, if you tax carbon at the border, this means that some countries will find it hard to send their products into the European single market. And I'm not necessarily talking about China or the US, probably not even the UK, because the UK has a pretty decarbonized domestic energy system. I'm talking about countries like Ukraine, Morocco, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and countries that are very close to home and that have taken a decision, which is to trade with the EU, but now they will probably find it very, very hard to decarbonize their energy system quickly enough so that they can keep on trading with the EU as they did before. What the EU probably also needs to think about that gets us a little bit further away from that is what the decarbonization pathway as part of that spillover effect mean for countries like Algeria, Libya, other petrostates in the near abroad. But the long and the short of it is, the moment you decarbonize a $16 trillion economy and you start hedging your bets with, for instance, a carbon tax at the border, it has ripple effects on countries that you trade with. And that also might mean that we have to think about the social contract there, about economic opportunity, and other things that might, in fact, at some point even turn into a security issue. What does this leave us? Well, I guess one of the things, and that's one of the findings that that I draw from a recent report we did with Carnegie, is that the EU essentially needs a much more holistic approach to its decarbonization policies. It needs to integrate its climate, trade, and foreign economic policies to make that work. Because competences at the moment are literally scattered across the Brussels bureaucracy. We have DG Klima, DG Ener, even DG Taxud, that's the tax directorate, because that's where CBAM sits. And what's needed is a whole of government approach to particularly the external effects of the EU Green Deal. And that needs to be coupled with support for poorer nations to help them do the right thing, which means decarbonize quicker, make sure they can still trade with the bloc and all of that. And that gets us into the just transition agenda, which I think the EU has embraced well, but not well enough because it stops at the border. We need to think about this beyond the European border and make it front and center of the European approach to international climate policy. And that's where I guess I stop here. If you want, I can still try and make more sense of the German situation in the Q&A, but I might just stop here and would very much like to thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Very, very stimulating beginning. Can I just ask one question? Isn't the claim that the European Union needs a more holistic approach a very familiar one from many areas of policy? And that there's a reason, or a number of reasons why it doesn't always happen, which is the reluctance of states and national governments to share sovereignty. Every bit of sovereignty that has been wrung out of them, they spend all their time trying to wrench back to themselves. And isn't that particularly true as far as environmental questions are concerned? Because when you talked about making it easier for countries to decarbonize, isn't there a need to do that within the European Union for the relatively poor countries, and not just outside? And is that going to happen? We can't hear you. We can't.
Sorry, this is we haven't done this for more than a year, right? So maybe 2 quick points on this. The first is, I think what's working in favor of the EU finding common ground and getting to an agreement on these kind of things is the very fact that we're talking about something that is at the core of the EU competence, which is trade and climate. Climate is something that EU member states have given to the EU as a mandate in the negotiations throughout the last COPs. And that makes things a lot easier. That's not the case for a lot of other things, but here it is. And they have, in fact, agreed on a pathway towards decarbonization, and they have all okayed that pathway. It's decisions taken by the heads of states. So I guess, particularly when it comes to the EU Green Deal and decarbonization policies, I think there is a great agreement on how quickly things need to be done and by what means they need to be done. And that gets me to the second point of your question, which is how do we make sure everyone within the European Union can decarbonize as quickly as it is needed, including the countries that are a little bit poorer than the average. And I guess there's two things to this. One, not everyone has to go the same speed. The Germans have to go quicker than others because the Germans are richer than others. And the second thing is the European Union has indeed put up a pretty comprehensive mechanism to what they call to ensure what they call a just transition. So there's a just transition fund that will help regions that are affected by the transition pathway, including coal mining regions, heavy industry regions, and so on and so forth. It will support companies that prove innovative to offer new pathways into a different economic future for those regions. And there's other mechanisms supporting that just transition pathway. In fact, this is one of the two main things that the EU has singled out as part of the EU Green Deal. So I'm not saying I'm positive, but at least what I'm saying is the EU knows where the problem is, and that they cannot expect, say, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, and maybe some less rich economies in the EU to do the same thing at the same speed as the Western counterparts.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very illuminating answer. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Professor Andy Jordan, who seems to have disappeared, to bring himself back in glorious Technicolor. There he is. Thank you very much indeed again for joining us. Professor Andrew Jordan is a professor of environmental studies, environmental sciences at the University of East Anglia. His particular focus of interest is political decision making, once again, particularly within the EU. He's led over the years a number of projects for the Cabinet Office, for the Commission, for the Dutch government, and he's a member of DEFRA's Science Advisory Council and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He, I think, will be following the theme that Andreas developed, that national decision-making and European decision-making are very difficult to disentangle. But he's going to be talking about an attempt which has been made to bring about such a disentanglement, namely the United Kingdom after Brexit. Good luck with that.
Thank you, Brendan, and wish me luck as well, as I try to share my slides, because I've got a small number of slides to show as well. So, do you see those?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, right. So yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I work at the University of East Anglia at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. But today, because you've asked me to talk about the UK and particularly Brexit, I'm sort of going to talk with a slightly different hat on, and that's with a hat bearing the name Brexit and Environment. Brexit and Environment is an academic network that was established after the referendum, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, amongst others. And essentially it tries to provide timely, sort of independent and impartial information on the more environmental implications and impacts of Brexit. So you asked me to talk about UK policy on climate change within a sort of EU setting, and right, hopefully that's now working. Okay, so as Andreas indicated, EU climate policy, and that's where I'm going to start with, has a number of sort of component parts. It has some very sort of long-term or medium-term targets, things like, you know, achieving net zero by 2050, and those sort of frame policy making. And within those are, or have been, relatively large packages of policy. The Fit for 55 policy package, which Andreas mentioned, is the most recent ones. But there have been a number of them since around 2000. And then within these packages are specific policy instruments. Again, as Andreas pointed out, we find lots of regulations, but there are other instruments as well, things like market-based instruments like emissions trading. And you can sort of think of these three elements as sort of sitting inside one another, a bit like a sort of Russian doll, with the sort of broader targets framing the packages, and then within those, the policy instruments. Now, if we look at the evolution of environmental policy, and I'm talking about environment policy now, not just climate policy, environment's broader than climate policy, you can see how it's developed over time. In particular, you can see how the number of environmental acts, pieces of items of policy instruments, essentially, has increased steadily over time. I think what this figure shows in particular is that actually, while the number has increased, it's generally sort of in the last sort of 10 years or so tailed off the increase. So it's sort of plateaued. And interestingly, also, the number of legally binding acts has sort of gradually decreased over time, whereas the number of non-legally binding environmental acts has increased. So it kind of gives a lie to the idea that Brussels or the EU only generates lots of binding regulation. So if you compare that with EU climate policy, you can see actually climate policy started to develop more recently than environment policy. So it started probably about halfway, or even sort of, around halfway on that sort of axis, the x-axis on the previous figure. So around sort of 1990. And again, it's increased steadily over time. But if we look at the different types of instruments that have been adopted, again, you can see very clearly revealed there that the point that Andreas was making earlier on is that in general terms, and if you look towards the column on the far right-hand side, you can see that most of the instruments that the EU has developed and adopted, are essentially regulatory. And they take the form of directives and regulations. By contrast, market-based instruments like taxes, emissions trading are relatively rare. There have been attempts to adopt sort of voluntary approaches to dealing with climate change, specifically dealing with emissions from cars, but they have generally not worked out so well and are no longer extensively used or used at all. Of course, those sorts of figures, though, indicate just a general count of the number of instruments. I mean, although emissions trading is an instrument, it nonetheless accounts for a significant proportion of the emissions from the EU. So you've got to be careful about thinking about their importance. Are we counting here the numbers of instruments or the emissions that they seek to address? And just to give you some examples of the types of instruments that are used, the regulatory ones actually deal with a whole range of different sort of sub areas of climate policy: renewable energy, biofuels, car emissions, energy efficiency. Some of them actually deal not with pollution per se, but actually with the collection of data from the member states, and which is then handed over to EU bodies like the European Environment Agency to give an overall picture of the extent of emissions reductions or the extent of policy effectiveness. Again, examples of some of the other instruments are not quite so common. Emissions trading is probably the best, perhaps really only significant example of a market-based instrument. And with the voluntary agreements, yes, were trialed in the sort of 1990s and early 2000s, but have largely fallen out of fashion. So if we go back to that sort of Russian doll sort of view of EU climate policy, actually what's happened is over time, the EU has started off by developing long-term targets, initially for, I think, 2000, and then for 2010, and then 2020. And then having done that, it's developed packages of policy to achieve those long-term targets. And within those packages, you can find whole bundles of policy instruments. Where are we right now? Well, at the moment, the EU is committed to, with its new climate law, to achieving net zero emissions, so completely eliminating all emissions by 2050 and reducing its emissions by 55% by 2030, hence Fit for 55. So the Fit for 55 package, which I think comprises around 13 different policy or policy instruments, is the one that's currently going through the policymaking process in the EU. And within the Fit for 55 package is a whole range of kind of different things to do with cars, emissions trading, the CBAM proposal, which again Andreas mentioned, taxation, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. Actually, a lot of these are essentially amending existing pieces of legislation. They're either extending their scope, or they're sort of making them more stringent or more effective. But in general, what the EU is embarking upon is a very significant acceleration in the scale and the speed of cuts, essentially trying to achieve as much in the 2030s that he achieved in the previous 3 decades, in terms of, at least in terms of emission reduction. So a really significant transformation in the stringency and scope of policy. So let me now turn to the UK. Well, I think the first thing to say, and this may sound a little bit surprising after all of the bitter sort of rancor of Brexit, is that EU climate policy today, even though it's a climate policy now spanning 27 member states, it's nonetheless still a hybrid policy, heavily shaped by the UK, but which has in turn also shaped the UK. So let me go down these 2 different columns and sort of first of all explain how the EU has shaped UK policy over the last 20 or 30 years. Well, certainly it's affected policy formulation and adoption processes by delivering these large packages of policy, which then the UK has had to implement. The EU has also pushed certain topics, which I think the UK, to be fair, has not thought so highly of or thought should be given such high priority. I mean, renewables, for example, and I'm thinking here in particular of offshore wind or energy efficiency. So it's pushed things faster and further than perhaps the UK would have wanted. All of these things backed with relatively strong, for essentially a trade agreement, relatively strong implementation mechanisms. So the power for the European Court of Justice to be involved, oversight by the European Commission, and the possibility of implementing fines for non-compliance. And what this has done, I think, has given EU policy, of course, within the UK, essentially then UK policy, with significant credibility. It's locked it into place. So when we think about policy being locked via a double lock, there's the lock of UN policy, but then that's also greatly supported and accentuated by the second lock of EU policy. That in turn has given investors the confidence to invest in things like offshore wind, and from that, whole areas of technology have developed and flourished massively on the back of EU policymaking. And sort of thinking about this more politically, I think what EU policy has allowed is sort of multi-level politics to emerge. So it's given, for example, sort of pro-decarbonisation actors within Whitehall, for example, BEIS, which currently is the department that oversees climate change. It's given it the ability to sort of win battles against departments that might otherwise not been as convinced about the need for decarbonisation. And also it's given politicians room for manoeuvre as well, because what the EU membership allowed them to do was to claim the credit for when things went well, but then to blame the EU when things didn't work out so well. So the EU, I think, has significantly shaped UK climate policy. But at the same time, I think the UK has undeniably, as a member state, shaped the EU's approach. It was a very significant advocate of higher ambition. You know, it formed a coalition of states within the EU pushing for faster reductions and more significant reductions. I think the UK has also been a significant source of scientific expertise within the EU. UK academics have been very influential, I think. And so have bodies like the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution and more recently the Climate Change Committee have made the sort of scientific and technical case for decarbonisation. I think, again, as Andreas pointed out, the UK has, I think, given significant support to the EU's external activities in this area. The UK, with its diplomatic capacities, its embassies all over the world, its significant presence within the UN Security Council, has allowed the EU to project its influence, I think, further than perhaps it might otherwise have done. Again, as Andreas said, the UK has been very keen on a particular type of or a particular approach to regulation, better regulation, so focusing on the cost effectiveness and efficiency of regulation. And you still see that that still leaves a significant imprint on EU policy. I think the UK also arguably pushed particular policy instruments like emissions trading, which it developed alongside, I think, Denmark in the 1990s. And then when it became expert in its use, began to upload the idea within the EU. And then finally, I think the UK, has arguably pushed the EU to deal not just with the reduction of emissions or mitigation, but also with the issue of adaptation, so preparing for more weather extremes and climate impacts. So if we think about the status quo now, 10 months after Brexit, we still see both the UK and the EU both having a very shared, strong legal commitment to net zero, substantial policy alignment because of 30 or 40 years of policy making and at least 20 or 30 years of climate change policy making. That policy which the EU developed has now been retained within UK law, so it's there in place. Indeed, parts of the UK, Northern Ireland and Scotland, are either, in the case of Northern Ireland, still within the single market and or have undertaken to align dynamically with EU policy to work almost in lockstep with the EU. I think climate change is very much something that Boris Johnson feels strongly about. You can see in the way that the UK is preparing for COP26 that this is something that allows Britain to give substance to the idea of global Britain operating successfully in international venues outside the framework of the EU. Nonetheless, there's still an important framework in place, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the UK and the EU, although it was rather painfully and negotiated, it nonetheless puts a very strong emphasis on climate protection. Many trade lawyers, trades experts see the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, as providing almost like the best example of a strong climate flow focused trade agreement. Indeed, within the TCA, climate change protection is an essential element, alongside things like the rule of law and the protection of democracy. So if either side reneges on its climate commitments, it provides a prima facie case for the other side to scale back or completely terminate the agreement. Now, if you go back to the different ways in which the EU has shaped the UK and the UK has shaped the EU, I think what Brexit has done is, I think, focused attention now on perhaps the absence of some of these elements. So, for example, in the past, looking on the left-hand side, as I said before, the EU has provided lots of policy formulation, policy adoption capacities for the UK. That, I think, is now something which the UK is now having to deal with itself. And I think it's perhaps realizing that actually adopting policy is a lot slower, a lot more difficult, and a lot more politically sort of taxing than just setting long-term targets and developing sort of very brief kind of strategies. And if you look further down the list as well, I mean, now the UK being outside the EU, okay, it's now in control, it's taken back control in the words of the Brexiteers, but with that control also comes the responsibility for policy, particularly policies that perhaps might have a negative impact on certain sections of society, or which might be perceived as particularly costly. So I think it's striking, for example, that the UK is still not as far down the road of policymaking as the EU has got. The EU has developed its European Green Deal, it's launched its Fit for 55 package. The UK has not yet launched all the elements of its equivalent to Fit for 55. In fact, some of them are still absent only a few weeks before the COP26. On the other side of the equation, of course, the UK used to be there in the EU advocating for higher ambitions. Its absence within the decision-making fora, I think, now makes it more difficult for what's left of that coalition, particularly to win some of these arguments with some of the more reluctant member states. And I think Andreas covered that sort of dynamic quite well in his presentation. And then finally, with the UK outside of the EU tent, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how well the EU projects its influence, not simply within COP26, but within future international policymaking processes. Okay, let me just wrap up now. So I think there are undoubtedly post-Brexit many areas in which cooperation between the UK and the EU could expand, certainly within the UN process, and we'll see with COP26 how well that fares. I think there's still the possibility within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to collaborate on the development and the application of climate science. The UK has applied for, but not yet been given full access to the EU's framework program, scientific framework program, Horizon Europe. But I think there are other ways in which, if the political will is there for the UK and the EU to cooperate on things like more technical things like data monitoring, policy evaluation, the sorts of things that sort of the UK used to participate in when it was a member of the European Environment Agency, and could still, if it wished to, participate in if it joined or rejoined as an associate member. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement also indicates that both the UK and the UK could collaborate more closely on things like emissions trading. They haven't so far, but possibly as as the speed of emission cuts increases, then it might make more sense for the two sides to collaborate. There's also the possibility to collaborate on carbon border adjustment taxes, which Andreas talked about. It's quite interesting that the Brexiteers are now talking about these things as well. People like Liam Fox and also the Prime Minister's father, Stanley Johnson. And finally, one important thing I think, which has not yet fully been appreciated, is that as the speed of carbon reductions increase and we begin to move away from just talking about emission reductions, perhaps also to actively removing carbon from the atmosphere, then through new technologies like direct air capture, then there might well be a possibility for the UK and the EU to collaborate more on standards, on verification systems and things like that. And these things are all eminently possible if there's the political will through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is a dynamic agreement and can, if there's political will, be adjusted over time. So let me finish. I mean, of course, there is also the potential for conflict. There is already conflict, as we know, in relation to the adoption of and implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But are there many possible flashpoints in relation to climate change where that conflict could also become more significant. So carbon border adjustment taxes is actually also one area. If cooperation doesn't take off, then I could see it possibly being an area where the EU and the UK end up conflicting with one another. There's also the possibility of one side regressing on its policy commitments, perhaps not so much in relation to climate change, and I'm thinking here in particular in terms of emissions reductions, because both sides essentially share similar objectives, but perhaps in areas related more to environment policy, like nature protection and air quality, for example. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement does, of course, provide for policy measures or rebalancing measures to be taken by either one side or the other in the event that the other side regresses too much. And it will be interesting to see whether those are used either in relation to climate change policy or, of course, in areas relating more to broader areas of environment policy. And then finally, of course, while the UK and the EU seem to be moving, at least in the climate area, in generally in sort of lockstep, of course, as the patterns of trade shift and as the UK begins to sign more trade agreements, perhaps with other parts of the world, we might see the UK and the EU pulling in different directions. But at the moment, that's still that possibility is still really not yet being realized, because trade negotiations, particularly with the US, have not advanced nearly as quickly or as far as perhaps the Brexiteers originally hoped. So there you go. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent, very, very thought-provoking. I just make one observation. My own assessment of the Conservative Party's attitude towards the TCA in general and everything that's in it is perhaps a bit more pessimistic than yours, in the sense that for a long time it was quite an important part of the Brexiter prospectus that we won't be bound by all these unnecessarily politically correct environmental regulations coming from Brussels. The Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment is the flashpoint, but may it not be the symbol of something more to come? May not the the possibilities and the prospects for a stable and constructive relationship in environmental questions between the EU and the UK, may those prospects not be a little bleaker than perhaps you suggested? Can I ask you to comment on that? But you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I've got a rather sticky mute button. So yeah, of course, I did add the caveat, if there is the political will. So there is the framework there with the TCA to collaborate if there's the political will. And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of political will on show in relation to Northern Ireland. In fact, both sides, and particularly the UK side, seem quite keen to manufacture as much disagreement and conflict as possible, possibly for domestic audiences. I think with the TCA and thinking particularly about environment and climate policy at the moment I don't see as being as prone to conflict and divergence. But I think there is certainly the possibility for divergence in areas that are not as directly related to climate change. I mean, at the moment, the UK government has launched all sorts of consultations on certain areas of environment policy, like the nature directives, and also areas of policy where where technology is developing rapidly, gene editing, for example. So although at the moment there hasn't been significant divergence in relation to the environment, I think certainly the environmental pressure groups in the UK are remaining extremely vigilant and want to keep a very close eye on the extent to which UK and EU policies diverge over time.
Thanks very much. Now we're coming to our third and by no means least distinguished speaker, Professor Burns. Welcome. Professor Charlotte Burns is Professor of Politics at Sheffield University and is particularly interested in political decision making and how it impacts on environmental decisions and policy. Before coming to Sheffield, Professor Burns taught at Aberystwyth, Leeds and York University. As has been mentioned, she's co-chair with Professor Jordan of the network Brexit and the Environment. I was very interested to see that she used to be an advisor to the chair of the European Parliament's Environment Committee. If it was Caroline Jackson, then I'm doubly amused because she was a colleague of mine. But I would be interested to hear a few words about what conclusions you drew from that. Final point I want to make is that obviously we were wrong in expecting that it will be possible for speakers to differentiate between national policies and European policies. So there's been a certain overlap in both the contributions. Would you like to fill in some of the gaps that you think have been left in these presentations? And then we've already got some interesting questions. We'll have an interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you very much. Tell us what you want to tell us for as long as you like.
Okay, brilliant. I've got some slides, some of which I'll skip over because there's been such thorough, impressive presentations from the previous two speakers that it's been covered. And while I set up sharing my screen, yes, I did indeed work in the European Parliament before I did my PhD. What's just happened? Where have you all gone? There we go. There we go. I worked for Ken Collins rather than Caroline Jackson, and it was a fantastic experience. I was in my early 20s, and it was a really exciting time to be in Brussels. It was around the time the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated and agreed. Yeah, and I had a fantastic time, and it primed me for doing my PhD and my long-standing interest in European environmental politics. I think what I'll do is sort of zoom out from the conversation we've had to remind us about COP26, which is part of the reason for this conversation. I assume that it's coming quite soon, and to think about what the why COP26 is significant, what sort of some of the key aims of COP26 are, and then come back to that question of challenges facing the European Union in relation to environmental policy, because it often finds COPs a slightly challenging space in which to exercise leadership. And slides for me are often an opportunity to put up pictures that make me laugh, and Boris Johnson offers ample opportunity to find pictures to make us laugh. So I've got one here of Boris Johnson thinking about Kermit the Frog. I don't know if you can see it, after his speech to the UN General Assembly the other week, in which he said Kermit was wrong when he claimed that it wasn't easy being green, because it should be easy to be green. And this is sort of the British position as it goes into COP26. It's easy to be green. And the UK government is taking the opportunity to try and get other states to ratchet up their ambitions. So this is the first sort of major opportunity to review nationally determined contributions, which were agreed at Paris. So each individual member state deciding what contributions it wants to make towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the Paris Agreement required states every 5 years to come together and ratchet up that ambition and review where they were. We're obviously 6 years post-Paris now because of the COVID pandemic. So this is also the first, and I've put post question mark, the first sort of COP that we've had since the pandemic. So that makes it quite significant as well. And as Andy already said, this is the UK's, part of the UK's attempt to develop a new reputation for Britain as part of its Global Britain platform, and it's part of, I think, trying to drive that idea that the UK is an environmental superpower, which is where Michael Gove said the UK wanted to be going post-Brexit. And the aims of this COP, there are basically 4 key aims, I think. The first is the ongoing challenge around addressing the emissions gap. So there's a very clear gap between where the IPCC says that we need to be getting to in order to meet the goal of limiting global temperature emissions to 1.5 degrees, and where the policies that we have in place and nationally determined contributions are going to get us to. So there's a big gap there. And one of the things that we want to be doing at this COP is getting states to actively address that emissions gap and to ratchet up their ambitions. The second is to address the finance gap. So back in Copenhagen in 2009, it was agreed that by 2020, states would be committing $100 billion a year towards climate finance. And there was a report by the OECD, I think in 2018, 2019, showing that we're still not there. And there was an idea that we would go beyond that amount post 2020. So that's obviously a key issue that will be debated at this COP. And there have already been some states making that making extra financial commitments. So the US has recently done that to try and get some way towards addressing the finance gap. I think for the climate vulnerable states, there's going to be an emphasis on trying to rebalance the focus of the COPs away from mitigation much more towards adaptation, which is a core issue for them. And I think, again, Andy mentioned the issue of adaptation. And the UK government is also putting quite a lot of emphasis on real economy commitments. So getting states to think about, tangible things they can do. So 2 headline real economy commitments are the move away from internal combustion engines, so getting states to move towards electric vehicles, for example, and there's a big push on that in the UK. And then secondly, getting states to move away from investing in coal. And there's some interesting, that's interesting in the UK context where there has been permission given for a new coal mine in Cumbria. So that raises questions about how do you exercise leadership? Surely you should be leading by example. So that's sort of the context of the COP. So we've already talked quite extensively about the EU's various legislation, so I won't go through that again, and I will move quickly on to challenges for the EU and maybe for the UK as well, and maybe for Germany too, as we move into the COP. So the first challenge, and I think Andreas, you touched on this really well, and Andy mentioned it as well, is this issue around speaking with one voice. But this takes on a particular resonance when we're talking about climate diplomacy, because at Copenhagen in 2009, the EU sort of got outmaneuvered by China and by the US and wasn't able to speak with one voice. And from 2009 up to Paris, there was a lot of emphasis in the positions adopted by the Council and the European Parliament on the need for the European Union to speak with one voice. So for states to be consistent, for the Parliament to maybe stop having a go at the Council, and to present a united front to the world so that the EU could exercise leadership. That is really challenging to do, though, when you have 27 states, some of whom are very climate skeptic. Andreas mentioned this emphasis on just transition, but there's some tricky issues to navigate here, because the just transition, you could argue, is a way of making side payments to states who are reluctant to sign up to more ambitious climate targets because they're dependent upon carbon in their economy. And there's some intersections emerging here around the sort of the wider legitimacy rule of law crisis. So in Poland in particular, there's been debates around Polexit in just the last week. And so some of the states that are asking for money out of the Just Transition Fund are also the states that are getting a lot of negative publicity over rule of law within their boundaries. And so that raises some challenging issues for the EU if it's going to be exercising leadership that actually may be within its own borders. As a legitimacy issue going on here. So that's a challenge. The other issue or key challenge for the EU is about the positionality of the US and China. So you would think with Trump departing the stage that would be good for the European Union, having Biden come in who's much more pro-climate. But in fact, the EU has always been able to exercise more of a leadership position when the US has sort of exited from international climate diplomacy. So with Biden coming back on again, it leaves less room for the European Union to exercise a sort of like moral leadership that it's tried to in relation to climate. And there's a question mark about what China's going to do. We haven't seen China's nationally determined contributions yet. And China's a major contributor towards CO2 emissions. So therefore, de facto is almost in a leadership position, because what it does makes a massive difference to the outcome of COP26. And we've seen a sort of a shift over time where the EU positioned itself as a leader in 2009. That failed spectacularly. And then we've got the great framework articulated by Backstrand and Elgström, suggesting the EU is more of a mediator, that it sort of tries to set a good example and then negotiates with other states and tries to bring them on side. I think the EU is probably not that comfortable with the idea that it will ever be a follower, but you've also got the question about younger people and the strikes, the school strikes campaign, and Greta Thunberg telling the EU, well, stop pretending to be a climate leader. You keep claiming you're a climate leader, but actually you're not doing enough, you're not going far enough. So there's that issue as well, not just for the EU, but actually for all the states that have this sort of disenchanted group of people who want to see more action. And we saw that play out in the German elections to some extent as well, a sense that Merkel's government really hadn't done enough on climate. And then a final challenge, obviously, is a question of Brexit. And Andy's quite right. The UK was seen as being critical in the Climate Council as a counterweight to the more sceptic states, but also in lending that sort of diplomatic expertise and heft. And there's some concern about whether or not the UK and the EU are going to be able to work cooperatively together at this COP. And it might be a nice bridge for doing that. Or actually, if they're not going to be in the same space, even though they share similar climate ambitions, there's actually relations between the two just aren't good enough yet for them to be seen politically to agree. So it may well be behind the scenes that there's lots of cooperation and collaboration going on, and sort of informal intelligence suggests that that's the case. But actually, there might not be much of a formal public rapprochement because it's not in either of their interests, particularly with the ongoing dispute over Northern Ireland. So those are sort of some of the issues that hadn't been touched on. And I suppose I'm going to put in a cheeky question for Andy, which is he suggested that, that the EU and the UK, that there wasn't, that they were very closely aligned on climate policy, and maybe there wasn't scope for much dispute. And I would just ask about carbon border adjustment mechanisms and Northern Ireland, and whether or not that might be scope for a dispute. Sorry, Brendan, that's a bit cheeky of me, but I will stop there.
We encourage interaction between our panelists. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, since a specific question's been put, I think Andy ought to answer it. And if Andreas wants to comment, then very welcome to do so. Andy.
Well, I mean, at the moment, such as the sort of zeitgeist in Northern Ireland, that anything to do with Northern Ireland could blow up into a political dispute at the moment. We'll see what emerges in throughout the course of this week, I think. But I think two things to watch. I think, yes, first of all, what emerges from the Lord Frost-led unit in the Cabinet Office, the Brexit Opportunities Unit. It'll be interesting to see whether that targets environment and climate policy. When I looked at the things that were mentioned in the sort of documents that were released a few weeks ago, environment was there, but it certainly wasn't a priority target. That could change. And secondly, I think with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I mean, I suppose, well, it's a potentially powerful tool. However, they're fiendishly complicated, and that's why the EU is not actually even now proposing to implement it until I think 2025 or even 2026. It depends a lot on what it targets. At the moment, it's targeted on things like aluminium, cement, these sorts of things that are generally not traded very much between the UK and the EU. And it also depends really on whether the UK develops its own carbon border adjustment mechanism to protect its own internal market from being undercut by trading partners in other parts of the world. So actually, how could I put it? The UK and the EU could end up sort of being, although they're not sort of ideologically on the same page, they could, for pragmatic reasons, decide that it's a good thing to do to, if not have the same border adjustment mechanism, then at least have a mechanism which is essentially operating in the same way and pegged at the same level.
Since Charlie put a question to Andy, I'm going to give Andreas the opportunity, if he wants, to comment on anything that's been said, because he started off kindly and then a lot of things were said. I'm sure there must be something that you can disagree with.
I'm afraid there isn't very much, really. I'm very sorry about that. I guess the one thing that I think I'd like to echo here is the point about CBAM. I mean, this is the devil's in the details as always, but as we see things evolving, we're talking about EIT. That means, the carbon intensive sectors, steel, cement, these kind of things, which probably isn't a big deal for UK trade. But more importantly, the UK has an ETS, right? It's once they left the European ETS, they developed a UK ETS, which is a very important step towards avoiding any types of carbon border adjustments. Because if, just for one thing, it makes the carbon accounting a lot easier, and finding ways of acknowledging the equivalent of the UK system. And by the way, again, I mean, the UK is a carbon leader or a low carbon leader when it comes to decarbonizing their energy system. I mean, the UK does no longer have coal in the electricity mix. I think it's what is it, 2% at the moment or something like that. The Germans are knocking on 40% still, right? So let's not forget how important the developments have been in the UK. And so I don't really think this is a big deal going forward. And I think the most important point here, I guess, is this is not about the UK. A CBAM is not about the UK. It's not even about the US. It may be about China, but it's more importantly, I think, about middle-income countries like Vietnam, emerging economies that are industrialized and now have an important decision to take, which is, where do they go? Do they go coal or do they go for renewables? And a CBAM will ideally help them take that decision. This is the primary goal and the primary target of a CBAM. It's not the UK. So I don't really think this is going to be a major headache going forward. There's going to be others, but not this one, maybe.
Good. Well, the first of our questions, I think, does go to Andreas as well. I'd like to hear his views on it. Could the panel please explain the tensions between EU climate change policy on the one hand and EU energy policy on the other? given the enhanced role of national governments in energy policy, as compared with what you rightly pointed out to be the Europeanization of climate policy?
I can quickly start, but we have two wonderful experts on the panel who probably know a little bit more about the legalities of this. I mean, the long and the short of it is both are areas of shared competence, which means the EU and the member states have competence to deal with climate and energy policy. The interesting thing about energy policy is that Article 194/2 says that each member state retains the rights to decide on, for instance, their supplies, their energy mix, different energy sources, and these kind of things. And that's interestingly where a lot of tension comes from, because on the one hand, you have clear climate policies and energy policies as defined on the European level. And on the other hand, you say, okay, but you can still do what you want. And that is something that creates tension and is problematic, particularly with countries that, like Poland, that retain a strong share of coal in the energy mix. I mean, Poland is at 90% when it comes to their electricity and heat. That compares to other countries like the former EU member, the UK, who have phased out coal completely. So I guess this is my 2 cents on that, but I don't want to occupy too much space here. So I certainly would very much like to give the floor to Charlotte and Andy.
Charlie, would you start us off on that?
Well, I suppose my response, and someone can correct me here if I'm wrong, is that it's not quite that straightforward that the EU does climate and nation states do energy, because we've got the Renewable Energy Directive. And actually one of the drivers, or one of the Renewable Energy Directive adoption is really interesting, because what sort of policy entrepreneurs did would go, there's a lot of concern about energy security in the European Union, and we want them to be ambitious in the run up to COP. So we're going to put these 2 agendas together, and that way we'll get this Renewable Energy Directive adopted. So I think there's ways in which the climate policies can drive energy policy in the member states, particularly where states are reluctant. But it's also a sign, as Andreas has indicated, of real disputes within the European Commission, depending on who has the energy portfolio and who has the climate portfolio. And I think in the UK context, we've got a major energy crisis at the moment. And one of the interesting issues there is there's a lot of criticism of this government. One of its kind of big Brexit moves was to get rid of the Department for Energy and Climate Change, which was tasked with bringing energy and climate change into conversation with each other and planning over the long term. And in a sense, I think that's what the European Union is sort of doing for member states. And whilst they retain a lot of control over their energy policy, the climate policy can be an important driver of that. But I don't know if Andy wants to come in. I think Andy.
Well, from a UK perspective, of course, there have been massive changes in the fuel mix over the last 30 or 40 years. You know, coal has declined, oil has declined, renewables have increased, sort of more or less nuclear has stayed about the same. But really, with the exception of the massive growth in offshore wind, I mean, very little of this is down to EU policy. It's mainly to do with you know, domestic policy objectives, domestic policy priorities. You know, things like decline of coal, for example, would have occurred without the EU's influence at all. Of course, and therefore the sort of climate change payoffs from those have been largely, I think, serendipitous. One other thing to point out is, nonetheless, I think the UK, when it was a member state, was very much in favour of integrating across different policy areas. You know, the greening of EU agriculture policy, for example, is something that the UK pushed very hard. Greening of energy policy at EU level is also something that the UK pushed very hard. But it's notoriously difficult to integrate across different policy areas. It's difficult at the national level, and it's certainly difficult at EU level as well. And in many ways, the sort of the whole European Green Deal thing is just is like a new installment in a very long story of attempts to integrate across different policy areas. In the past, it was, on the grounds of environmental protection, but nowadays it's very much, the sort of the framing of it and the rationale for doing it is in relation to climate change and specifically net zero. So we'll see where the EU gets with this, with the UK out of the sort of debating chamber.
In the context of energy, somebody has put a specific question, which I think Andreas should answer. Hasn't national energy policy in Germany concerning nuclear power meant that Germany now has much higher levels of CO2 production and is now much more dependent on dirty coal and lignite? Is that true?
I think it's a little bit too easy. I mean, the nuclear has not been replaced by coal necessarily. Maybe it hasn't helped pushing coal further out of the mix, but it hasn't thrown coal a lifeline or something like that. I think, I mean, the Germans could have done a lot more, and that's indeed, as what Charlotte alluded to, the conservative-led government could have done a lot more over the past years to heed the call and address the coal issue much more forcefully. They didn't do so. Now they lost the power, and indeed, in part because of that failure. But what the Germans also did, and we shouldn't forget that, and that was domestic policy, is they ramped up renewables, and quite significantly. Renewables are knocking on 40-ish% of the electricity mix. On good days, there's more than 100%. And for an industrialized country, that's remarkable, and the remarkable, the very fact that the lights didn't go out, given the quick ramp up of renewables over the last couple of years, is interesting. So in part, renewables did replace coal. Did replace nuclear. But coal could have left the energy mix a lot quicker had we possibly postponed the nuclear phase out. Nuclear is gone. I mean, that's a thing of the past. We shouldn't be looking back. We need to look forward. And I guess the next big question is coal indeed, and how quickly it will need to leave the system. At the moment, it's 2038. A lot of people say that's way too slow. It's particularly the Green Party, but also a lot of the electorate voting for the Social Democrats who said this can't be, this should be done a lot quicker. So the Greens are now eyeing the early 30s, which would be a significant step forward. And I guess this is literally the next thing that the German policy will address. One of the reasons why I'm very much kind of trying to get some information coming out of the coalition talks, but no one will tell me what they're discussing at the moment.
Good. One question that's been raised in a number of different ways is the question of how far Europe makes itself globally uncompetitive by adopting zero carbon or similar policies that others, particularly China and the United States, don't adopt. All of you referred to it in passing, but would you care to give some more considered statements on that dichotomy? Is it a real dichotomy? Andy, perhaps, could you start?
Well, the sort of claim that, more stringent environmental and particularly climate standards are making parts of or sections of the economy uncompetitive is a very, very old argument, and it's been trotted out time and time again by different parts of the business sector, and yet time and time again there seem to be precious few actual examples of industries either going out of business purely because of environmental and the climate change standards, and or relocating to other parts of the world. And so we kind of almost end up in a sort of, it becomes almost a sort of phony war between, you know, sections of industry which use this potential threat or this potential effect as something to argue for slower emission reductions, or for certain areas of the economy to be exempt from making reductions. And this sort of debate has powerfully influenced, you know, policy instruments like emissions trading, which of course now you know, provide free allowances to certain polluters, and or phase in the emissions reductions over, you know, relatively long periods of time. But on the other side, you also get those pushing for stronger controls, like those in the Commission, in DG Klima, also using potential instruments like CBAM as a way of, you know, saying, well, if there is a potential relocation of jobs or of economic activity, then don't worry, we've got this instrument in place. So yeah, there's a lot of discussion about this, leading to a large extent a kind of phony war between the different sides. But the extent to which it actually plays out in reality, I think, is far from clear.
Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, I think Andreas touched on this in his initial presentation, and I don't know if you use the term market power Europe, Andreas, but that's sort of what I went to in my mind. And it's this, you know, is it a gamble by the European Union, or is it the European Union being confident in the size of its market power, that it's prepared to make this move in the hope that it will be facing a California effect instead of a Delaware effect? So the California effect, where you take this position and everyone else goes, oh, okay, we want to access this market, so we're prepared to play ball. Or other countries go, well, we won't bother with the European Union, we're not interested in that, we'll make our own products cheaper and we'll be able to access markets elsewhere. And I think the European Union has shown over time that actually, generally speaking, the California effect is what tends to hold true. And it comes back to that question as well about China and the US's position. You know, it partly the effectiveness of the market power Europe approach is whether or not other actors are prepared to play ball. And Biden's certainly paying lip service to the idea of being more ambitious on climate than his predecessor was. And we don't know what the Chinese position is likely to be. But I would say it doesn't necessarily mean that it's disadvantageous for the European Union. It depends on the position that other states take, and the EU has been successful in sort of exercising its economic muscle, its soft power in this way before, in a way that has enabled it to claim this mantle of being a climate leader. So it's sort of, let's wait and see, but I think the EU wouldn't make the move if it didn't think it was going to be successful. But there are question marks about, you know, Andy said, is it 2026, that whether or not, how ambitious the CBAM proposals will be, and if they're not, it might be for exactly these kinds of reasons.
Andreas.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I guess there's only two things I'd like to add. One, is the EU convinced they can play ball? Well, maybe they are, but if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So the one thing that they have is market power. That's it, right? They don't have the Royal Navy or, you know, things like that. They cannot put boots on the ground. Not that's necessary, that this is necessary, but the point is they are not a proper state. And so the moment you have one toolbox, you use it. And we've seen this repeatedly also in other domains. And whereas a big other power, or the superpower, the US, they also use the market, they also leverage the market. Just think about the sanctions that we've seen under Trump for achieving political purposes, not necessarily climate purposes, but other political purposes. But they also have the other toolbox, the hardware. You know, the gunboats and all that stuff. And that's something the EU does not have. And so, yes, hopefully they're simply confident, but maybe they also run out of other options. And but the one way I would think about CBAM is also to have this, and that's maybe my second point, to think about it as a little bit of a carrot and a stick approach. You know, you can say, look, we really got to talk trade and climate and, you know, how to make sure we avoid carbon leakage. And can you guys please just get on a track towards an ETS system and or carbon pricing? And, you know, think about ways we have tested already. The UK have tested a carbon floor price and all these kind of things. There's various things that are out there that you can push them towards, nudge them towards, and then say, well, we've talked about all of this, you better do this, or else would be a CBAM. If I was the EU and if I was a trade negotiator, I would probably do it that way. And that's a little bit how I see this, which means even if you have it in place in 25 or 27, rather probably, as far as I see things, it might still be something that may not simply be used because equivalents are acknowledged as being in place in key trading partners and countries that might become a problem. We're certainly not, maybe that's the last point, we're certainly not talking about, you know, the least developed countries because they simply don't trade with the EU, not very much. We're talking about those, again, those middle income economies that now have to take a choice, and those are the ones that are targeted. So I guess if they end up taking the right decisions and putting things in place that go the right direction, the EU might just you know, leave the CBAM where it is and not apply it.
Final question about financing of transitions. Is the European and the Western banking system stable enough to be able to guarantee that there will be the flow of finance necessary to make these transitions? Charlie, do you think that's a problem?
I don't know enough about the European banking system to feel like I can comment. What I can say is that there's an awful lot of focus at the European level, and has been for about the last 5 years, on the question of green financing. So I think this is at the forefront of policymakers' minds. But yeah, I defer to others on the stability of the European banking system as to whether or not it can underwrite this, because yeah, that's way out of my area of my comfort zone. So I'm just, yeah, I'm going to bat that to someone else. Sorry.
Okay. Who wants to take it up? Andy.
I think pass from me.
Yeah. Andreas, do you want to say something?
Maybe 2 lines on this. The first is, I don't think money is a problem, because we will very soon have a lot of money, a lot of capital trying to find a new home. I mean, just think about the taxonomy and what it will do to investment going forward. I mean, people maybe haven't understood really what the taxonomy is. It essentially is a document that will determine whether you will have a yield on an investment going forward or not. And it's a very political document. So the taxonomy will mobilize loads and loads of capital. Maybe capital that's now tied into fossil assets and needs to find a new home, or it will, or on top of it, it will mobilize capital that now sees opportunity because new investment opportunity opens up because something is considered a green, hence sustainable, hence worthy investment according to the taxonomy. That's I guess, my one line around the EU. Now, the one thing that obviously, and other people will be a lot better positioned to talk about this, but one of the things that's missing in the EU is a deep integrated capital market. It is not as integrated as, say, the American capital market, and that is a problem because if you want to mobilize the funds that are needed, and estimates differ, but it's billions and billions and billions a year, then you ideally have a deep, integrated, mature capital market. So I guess one of the tasks going forward is not only to think about what's right, what's wrong in terms of investment, it's also to make sure that the European capital market can deliver. But maybe a final point, and that goes just to say that, you know, capital market integration will need to become a thing, and much more important now that the UK has left, which is the financial center of the European, yes, also of the European Union still. Pity they left. But maybe a final point, and that goes back to the UK. I mean, just think about this. If you look at the London Stock Exchange, about 25% of the assets in the London Stock Exchange are in fossil assets, directly or indirectly. And depending on how quickly major steps are taken, including the taxonomy and all these kind of things, this money will start moving. Or it has to be written off prematurely. And this is something that I see as an issue going forward, because you can either say, well, we trust markets to get this done well, or you can say, well, we have seen a couple of situations in the past, for instance, 2008, where markets just bet the wrong way. And we're talking about massive, massive amounts of money. So I guess one of the things that we will need to do going forward is to really think about financial market management from a regulatory perspective, just to make sure all of this gets a soft landing.
Well, thank you very much. And that took the conversation a bit wider. Can I just ask a final question? Do you think that that the environmental and green aspect of the new financing program that the European Union is now engaged in made it easier for German public and elite opinion to accept something which they've been very reluctant to accept up till now, namely the creation of quasi-government debt through green bonds?
That's a question for me, I guess.
Yes, it is indeed.
All right. Look, I think the tough truth here is that the German public simply will not understand the details of green bonds or any type of European debt, or how much money really comes back from the European Union. And you cannot blame them for them. It's probably the same in most of the European Union countries. But this certainly did not, I'm not someone who studies elections and electoral politics, but I would argue that this did not have a major impact on the decision of the average German voter. It's a lot more mundane than that. You know, why didn't bureaucracy work when it was needed? Why did it still use fax machines rather than email or other forms of communication to report COVID cases? Why did we not get to an agreement in the federal system on how to deal with a pandemic situation? What is it that we can do in order to get our house in order in climate policy? These are the kind of questions that people asked. In addition to other questions that were high up on the agenda, including social divide and all of these kind of things. The last thing I think people really were concerned about is common debt, green bonds, any other types of European bonds, and things that left the confines of a very really national election campaign. I mean, if you look at the debates that they had between the top candidates, Europe didn't really feature, which was a shame, but it did not feature. Foreign policy did not feature. It was purely domestic policy areas and concerns that did feature. So without having done the math on this, I would say it didn't swing the votes into any directions. It just didn't play a role.
Well, I can't remember a Federal Trust event where I've learned more. So very selfishly, I'm going to give Charlie and Andy the opportunity to say a bit more or concluding remarks in the hope that I'll learn even more. Charlie, would you like to make a concluding contribution?
Well, I suppose I'd quite like to jump on the back of what Andreas just said, because there's a wonderful irony here that German voters weren't bothered about the European Union, but the European Union's really bothered about who won the German election and what's going to happen now. Everyone's kind of intently watching Germany to see how it plays out and which coalition we'll end up with, because that will make a difference to the kinds of policies that we see going forward, particularly in relation to finance and climate, for example, depending on where the balance turns out. And then I suppose my final comment would just be that it's going to be really interesting to see what happens at COP26 from a Brexit perspective in terms of the relationship between the UK and the EU, and whether or not I suspect what we'll see is that officials cooperate, but I don't think we're going to see much of a rapprochement between the EU and the UK in a public way. I hope I'm wrong. And I'm also intrigued to see whether or not it's going to be a success or not. I have some quite cynical views about how that might play out, but again, I hope I'm wrong on those. I'll hand over to Andy at that point.
Final word.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just again, coming back to the sort of UK-EU relationship, I think it'd be interesting to see how COP26 unfolds. I suspect, though, that will be a slightly sort of anomalous setting in which to sort of look at those dynamics, because the UK is in the chair. It's the presidency of the COP, and normally, even if it had been a member state of the EU, it would have been operating slightly at arm's length from the EU. It would have certain functions to perform as the president of the COP. I think more interesting is kind of what happens after COP26, as the UK sort of surrenders the presidency and finds itself as an ordinary participant, an ordinary state, but without the framework of that larger voting and market power that it had as a member of the EU. The other way of looking at the relationship between the UK and the EU and see how that's unfolding is actually in domestic UK politics. And I think what's been quite interesting about the last few years is that the Conservative government have been very, very good at adopting targets, adopting strategies. Where they've been struggling, I think, is in delivering the sort of, the nitty-gritty policy to deliver on those targets. And there's two crucial bits of policy that have really kind of disappeared, missing in action prior to COP26. One is a proper costed Treasury-backed plan for implementing net zero. That was being long promised. It hasn't appeared. It may appear before COP26. I think a lot of us, though, are thinking it probably won't appear now. And the second thing is a kind of almost like a strategy for harnessing all those other sort of, climate-related strategies, a kind of a strategy of strategies. This is something that the UK parliamentary committees have pushed the Conservative government to deliver for many, many months now. And again, there's been no sign of it at all. It may appear before COP26, it may not. In the past, the UK could have almost sort of sat back and let the EU do all the hard work and the heavy lifting to deliver such a strategy. Now, it's got to do that hard work itself.
And serve them right, some people might say. But thank you very much indeed for this tremendous tour de force from all the three speakers. When Charlie talked about the way in which the German elector may not have been in Europe, but Europe was very interested in what the German elector was doing, I'm reminded of Trotsky's remark that you may not be interested in the revolution, but the revolution is certainly interested in you. I think a more acceptable way of phrasing that thought would be that we've had a tremendous lesson in interdependence this evening, and that's been the underlying theme of everything that everyone said. And thank you very much. Those who live longest will know most. Good night to you all. Good night to all our viewers. And I hope you come back for another helping of the Federal Trust next time. We have something which will probably be towards the end of October.